What happens when a sealed royal vault is unlocked after months of speculation, and what lies inside shatters decades of expectation? In a moment meant to honor Queen Elizabeth's legacy, the quiet unsealing of her private estate has triggered a storm. At the center of this whirlwind is Catherine, Princess of Wales, who has just inherited items that Camilla, Queen Consort, believed were rightfully hers. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The morning began in silence, with the grandeur of Windsor veiled in fog and secrecy, as key members of the royal family were summoned to attend the discreet unlocking of Queen Elizabeth II's private vault. No cameras, no statements, just the cold hush of protocol and anticipation that only such events within monarchy command. Trusted aides, sworn to secrecy, couldn't hide the tension etched on their faces as they turned the keys and drew open what had remained untouched since the monarch's death. And within moments, a single phrase was whispered among those closest to the scene. "It's not what anyone expected." Camilla, confident and composed, arrived fully assured that her status as Queen Consort entitled her to the late Queen's most treasured items, heirlooms, she had been led to believe were informally promised to her in private years past. Her entourage expected nothing less than a transfer of regal power enshrined in jewels and memorabilia. But then came the shock. Sealed envelopes were found, delicate cream stationery marked with the late Queen's personal insignia. Each envelope was carefully attached to select items, from brooches that had once graced the Queen's lapel to tiaras worn during coronations. But it wasn't Camilla's name inscribed on those envelopes. It was Catherine's. A thunderclap of realization rippled through the room. The Duchess of Cambridge, now Princess of Wales, had been personally selected to receive these intimate relics of monarchy. Prince William, standing beside his wife, reportedly turned pale, stunned by the clarity of the Queen's final wishes. For a family steeped in symbolism and hidden messages, the gesture spoke louder than any decree. The Queen had made a choice not merely of inheritance, but of legacy. Royal watchers outside the palace were left scrambling as whispers emerged. This wasn't just a matter of personal belongings. This was a message to the nation, and more critically, to the family. That Catherine, not Camilla, embodied the values and image the late monarch wished to carry forward. It was a tectonic shift beneath the polished surface of royal decorum, a rewriting of the palace's quiet power structures. The consequences, however, were only just beginning to unfold. But if Camilla was blindsided by this inheritance, what exactly did Catherine receive, and why were these items so symbolic of royal continuity? Camilla had one expectation: to finally secure the pieces she believed Queen Elizabeth intended for her legacy. Instead, she watched in stunned silence as items she long believed were spoken for were passed unexpectedly to Catherine. A moment that was meant to cement her reign instead exposed a painful divide. For years, Camilla had operated under the belief that her position, hard-fought and hard-won, had earned her a quiet assurance from the late Queen. It was whispered among palace insiders that certain heirlooms, particularly those linked to Queen Mary and the early Windsor lineage, were meant to one day rest in Camilla's hands. The sapphire tiara, once worn on the day of her wedding to Charles and symbolic of her transition into royal life, had long been assumed to be hers in legacy, a kind of spiritual confirmation of acceptance. But as the names on the envelopes were read aloud in the private viewing, that tiara was not among her allocations. It wasn't even mentioned. Instead, piece by piece, royal history was being handed to Catherine, with brooches from Queen Mary's collection and antique pins that hadn't seen daylight in decades now listed under her name. There was no announcement, no explanation, only a thick, painful silence, as Camilla realized she had not only been overlooked, but perhaps never truly included in the Queen's final vision. Insiders say the tension in the room was unbearable. Camilla's expression didn't waver, but her face reportedly tightened like stone, as though every nerve had gone cold beneath the surface. She stood still, regal on the outside, but with a fire flickering just behind her eyes. Charles, seeing the discomfort growing, reportedly attempted to ease the moment with a flippant remark, something about the jewels being just things, and that everyone would get a surprise or two. But the attempt fell flat. The remark was met with silence, some say even glares, as if the gravity of what had transpired demanded something deeper than dismissive charm. Because this wasn't about trinkets, this was about the late Queen's unspoken loyalties, about whom she trusted to carry her image forward. And while the world had accepted Camilla's title, it seemed the Queen herself had reserved something different for her legacy. A choice made in secret, a message left in inheritance. For Catherine, it was a quiet coronation. For Camilla, a thunderous humiliation without a single word spoken. Royal aides, those who've lived long enough within palace walls to sense shifts in wind, now say the signs were always there. That despite public reconciliations and official portraits, Queen Elizabeth never fully handed over her trust to Camilla. This moment, the handing over of heirlooms meant for queens, not consorts, confirmed what many had long suspected, but dared not say. The Queen's silence had spoken, and in doing so, drawn a line not of blood, but of legacy. But how did Catherine become the chosen one for these historic pieces, and what silent message was the late Queen trying to send? Hidden within the velvet folds of a 19th-century jewellery case, royal staff discovered a letter written in Queen Elizabeth's unmistakable hand, addressed solely to Catherine. Its contents were never meant for public eyes, but what it revealed about trust, legacy, and womanhood sent shockwaves through the family. Dated just 3 months before her passing, the letter was found tucked beneath an antique lace handkerchief, its placement deliberate, its timing haunting. It was not listed among the official documents tied to the inheritance process. It was not referenced in the formal briefings given to Camilla or even to Charles. This was personal, a private confession from a queen to the woman she quietly regarded as her successor in spirit, if not in title. Those who have seen the letter speak of its tone neither cold nor grand, but deeply reflective. The Queen wrote of watching Catherine grow within the institution, noting her restraint, dignity, and loyalty in times that would have tested the strongest. Then came the line that has since become a silent thunderclap within the palace. These are yours not by blood, but by example. It was not just an endorsement, it was a handing over, a signal that the Queen saw Catherine as more than a dutiful wife to the heir. She saw her as the embodiment of the qualities that once defined her own reign: grace under pressure, silence in storm, and unwavering devotion to duty, even when the cameras stopped rolling. The letter didn't name Camilla, but its shadows did. Those who came late but reached far, the Queen wrote with unmistakable precision, a phrase many believe to be a thinly veiled reference to the Queen consort. The absence of this letter from Camilla's briefings was not an oversight, it was a choice, a boundary set, a secret protected. And when Catherine read those words for the first time, it said she didn't speak, didn't react outwardly. She simply wept, silent tears tracing the contours of a face now marked by a weight she hadn't asked for but could no longer deny. In that single moment, the heirlooms surrounding her brooches, tiaras, bracelets meant something entirely different. They were no longer just symbols of power. They were reminders of expectation, of a promise now sealed by pen, not proclamation. What Queen Elizabeth left behind was more than legacy, it was a message encoded in emotion. And the family, especially Camilla, knew it. With the Queen's personal words echoing through the royal chambers, attention turned to the most controversial item of all, an estate jewel rumoured to be cursed. No one expected it. The emerald choker, once belonging to Queen Victoria and worn only twice by Queen Elizabeth, emerged from its glass case like a ghost of the past. Camilla had her eyes on it for years, yet it was passed to Catherine, stirring centuries-old rumours of rivalry, danger, and feminine rebellion. There was no official announcement, no carefully orchestrated photograph, just a murmur that turned into a roar when the box was handed to Catherine, and she found inside not only the infamous choker, but a handwritten card bearing 7 chilling words. For strength, in storms yet unseen, ER. This wasn't a fashion statement. It was a thunderbolt, because the choker, while dazzling in its brilliance, carried with it a dark undercurrent of history, one that courtiers had long avoided speaking of publicly. Behind palace walls, it was known simply as the Emerald Omen. Legend has it that those who wore the choker without the monarch's true blessing suffered misfortune, scandal, or exile. Passed down from Queen Victoria, it was a piece wrapped not just in emeralds, but in warning. Queen Elizabeth herself only wore it twice before retiring it quietly to the vaults. And while Camilla had reportedly referred to the choker in private as her birthright by marriage, she never laid a finger on it. Sources say she expected it to be presented to her as a final act of royal acceptance, but instead, it became the crown jewel of Catherine's quiet coronation. The reaction from within the royal circle was immediate and visceral. Courtiers scrambled to contain the significance of the transfer. Leaks were discouraged, coded language used in briefings, and staff sworn to confidentiality. But it was too late. The note, the history, the choker, they all pointed to one truth: that Queen Elizabeth was leaving behind not just possessions but prophecies. Camilla, whose allies had already begun whispering about inconsistencies in the inheritance process, now found herself in a deeper shadow. Her frustration, already simmering from the exclusion of key heirlooms, now teetered on something more dangerous: public embarrassment. And the more she pushed, the more insiders began to question: had she ever truly held the Queen's trust? Or had Catherine, through years of silent resilience, earned a place that titles alone could never grant? The emerald choker was no longer a jewel. It had become a symbol of tension, of power, and of an unfolding storm. The Queen's decision to pass it to Catherine had not only unearthed ancient rumours, but also stirred fresh speculation about who had truly influenced her final choices. Was this all part of a long-hidden plan? A deliberate nod to the past as a warning for the future, or a final silent act of defiance by a monarch who understood legacy better than anyone alive? But beyond the jewels, another battleground was quietly forming, one made not of gold or gemstones, but of royal roles, future titles, and public favour. While the cameras remained outside the palace gates, Camilla was fighting a battle behind closed doors. Sources say she went cold, then silent, then furiously strategic. Inheriting a crown is one thing, but losing the legacy is another. This wasn't just about items. It was about status, and Catherine had just leapt forward. The inheritance had not just shaken Camilla, it had dismantled the invisible scaffolding she had spent years quietly building. Within hours of the revelation, she convened emergency meetings with her most trusted advisors, not out of panic, but out of necessity. The conversations behind those walls were intense, candid, and laced with quiet fury. For Camilla, this wasn't just a personal slight, it was a public undermining of her position as Queen Consort. Reports suggest she confronted King Charles in private, not with raised voice, but with tightly controlled resolve, accusing him of allowing her to be humiliated in front of the family. The timing, the secrecy, the absence of any warning, she wanted to know how it had come to this without her knowledge or inclusion. Charles, blindsided himself, reportedly offered vague explanations and pointed to the Queen's autonomy in her final months. But the damage was done. That night, Camilla cancelled an upcoming public appearance, citing emotional fatigue, a phrase the press seized upon as a thinly veiled admission of internal strife. Palace insiders began whispering of a cold withdrawal, a quiet distancing by Camilla from public engagements, from family functions, and even from palace decisions. The rift between her team and William's, always tense, always quiet, began to widen. Communications were delayed, meetings postponed, requests ignored. There was no open hostility, but there didn't need to be. The inheritance had drawn a new line in the sand, and it was growing clearer by the day who stood on which side. Outside the gates, the public began to shift. Polls released days after the inheritance became known showed a stark tilt. Royal commentators who once treaded lightly began speaking openly about legacy, symbolism, and the Queen's possible intent. The conversation had changed, and Camilla could feel it. No matter her title, no matter her crown, she now stood in the shadow of a woman who had not asked for this power but had undeniably been granted it. Yet as Camilla receded from the spotlight, another figure stepped forward, not with fanfare, not with speeches, but with deliberate silence and a symbolic presence that turned heads across the nation. As Camilla pulled back, Catherine stepped into a new role and made a quiet but defiant appearance that changed the conversation completely. Underneath the surface of glittering heirlooms and ancient jewels, a quieter war had begun, one that couldn't be displayed in velvet-lined boxes or worn across polished necklines. This battleground was far more volatile, not about what Catherine now possessed, but what she might soon represent. Roles, titles, and the public's gaze were shifting, almost imperceptibly but undeniably. The emerald choker had reignited something deeper than jealousy. It had awakened dormant ambitions, challenged long-held assumptions, and created a power vacuum Camilla hadn't anticipated. While Camilla still held the crown of queen consort, the people, the palace aides, and even foreign dignitaries were beginning to look toward Catherine with new eyes, not as a dutiful wife in waiting, but as the living embodiment of a legacy the late queen had once guarded fiercely. And while no official declarations were made, the language began to change. Invitations to key diplomatic events began addressing Catherine not just with formality, but with subtle elevation. Royal photographers started positioning her at the center rather than the side. And in private conversations among seasoned courtiers, there was now open discussion of Catherine's increased future visibility. William, too, began stepping into more central roles, clearly aware that public confidence was coalescing around their union, their image, and the symbolism they now carried. Camilla, meanwhile, found herself sidelined not by force, but by momentum. Each appearance she cancelled, each event she declined to attend, only widened the space Catherine quietly filled. This wasn't a coup. It was evolution. Yet, within that gentle transition, lay unmistakable tension. Reports began to surface of behind-the-scenes resistance. Camilla's advisors seeking clarification from Charles about future ceremonies, her press team pushing back against the sudden surge in Catherine-focused narratives. But it was too late. The Queen's choices had reshaped the chessboard. And now, even palace insiders who once defended Camilla's rise began whispering of a Catherine era, slowly but unmistakably taking form. The question no longer centered on jewels. It centered on narrative, on trust, on legacy, and on a queen's quiet but calculated gesture that had turned inheritance into influence. As the choker rested in Catherine's possession, so too did a weight of expectation that even she hadn't sought. Because what came next would not be measured in emeralds, but in eyes, and all of them were watching. As Camilla pulled back, Catherine stepped into a new role and made a quiet but defiant appearance that changed the conversation completely. Catherine didn't speak a word, but her appearance at a royal gala days later said everything. Draped in the Queen's favourite brooch, her silhouette echoed the late monarch herself. This wasn't fashion. It was a statement. The torch has passed. And for some in the palace, that realization cut deep. It wasn't just what she wore, but how she wore it. Queen Elizabeth's pearl and diamond brooch, famously reserved for the most formal of ceremonial duties, had not been seen since the monarch's final public appearance. And yet there it was, gleaming against Catherine's gown like a seal, a quiet signature of continuity. What made it even more remarkable was her choice to attend the event without Prince William at her side. It broke from tradition, rewrote expectation, and made her presence entirely her own. This was not a consort standing in support, this was a figure stepping forward. Her hairstyle, subtly altered, carried echoes of Queen Elizabeth's early reign, drawing whispers from the moment she arrived. Nothing about this appearance felt coincidental. Body language experts dissected her every movement and came to a stunning conclusion. Calculated elegance with silent command. She smiled, nodded, spoke only when approached, but her silence thundered louder than any speech. Camilla's absence from the same event did not go unnoticed. Her team issued a brief explanation citing scheduling, but insiders suggest it was a strategic retreat, To stand beside Catherine at that moment, on that night, would have only fueled the narrative she was desperately trying to contain, because by then, the comparisons were everywhere. Social media lit up with side-by-side images of Catherine and the late Queen expressions, posture, even the way they held their hands. Commentators began calling Catherine the true reflection, suggesting that perhaps the Queen's greatest legacy wasn't a title or a jewel, but a woman she had quietly molded, trusted, and chosen. The moment went viral not because of what Catherine said, but because of what she represented. A monarch in waiting without a crown, without a title, but with something far more powerful: recognition. And with every camera flash, with every whispered compliment in the marble halls, it became clear that the center of gravity had shifted. This wasn't just a step forward, it was a pivot, and Catherine had become the new axis. But behind the public elegance was a rising question no one wanted to ask aloud. Did Queen Elizabeth intend for Catherine, not Camilla, to carry her legacy into the future? Queen Elizabeth's reign was marked by restraint, diplomacy, and quiet calculation. But what if her final move wasn't public at all, but a private inheritance designed to shift royal power subtly, irrevocably, and permanently toward the woman she saw as her true successor? For over 70 years, Elizabeth mastered the art of symbolism. She never wasted a word, rarely made emotional gestures, and always kept her cards close to the chest. Every brooch, every appearance, every silence intentional. So when her personal heirlooms, letters, and historic jewels bypassed Camilla and landed in the hands of Catherine, it didn't read as oversight. It read as strategy. The contrast between the two women was undeniable. Catherine, shaped by decades of silent dedication, never overstepped. Her loyalty had never wavered. No scandals, no defiance. Just quiet, consistent service. Camilla, by contrast, carried the burden of a controversial past, one that the Queen had, on the surface, accepted but perhaps never entirely trusted. And in the royal world, legacy isn't defined by public statements, it's written in traditions, choices, and what is left behind when the crown is no longer in play. Those who studied the Queen's final years now see the breadcrumbs. In her last few Christmas broadcasts, the Queen's Question 7, she emphasized service above self, praised those who endure quietly, and singled out the younger generation for preserving the dignity of the monarchy. It wasn't just warm sentiment, it was foreshadowing. One royal historian stated without hesitation, "This was not accidental, it was orchestrated." Behind the scenes, archivists discovered that the Queen had quietly amended several codicils in her will mere months before her passing. These amendments shifted the destination of several personal items and ensured they would go directly to Catherine with no requirement for Charles's approval. Why that mattered is simple. It made the gifts irrevocable. And more importantly, it bypassed Camilla entirely. Among the items were pieces with deep historical resonance, those worn by queens during wartime speeches, on state visits to nations now fractured, on anniversaries of victory and mourning. Items that carried weight not just of wealth, but of message. The Queen knew exactly what she was doing. She had long played the long game, and now, from beyond the grave, she had set the board for a new chapter, one that quietly but unmistakably placed Catherine in the position of moral and symbolic authority. No speeches, no announcements, just a collection of choices too deliberate to ignore. Because in Elizabeth's world, legacy wasn't about noise, it was about knowing exactly where the spotlight would fall when she was gone. And it was falling now, squarely, on Catherine. As questions of legacy swirl, so do questions of loyalty, and whispers are growing louder that this inheritance could ignite something much deeper. William reportedly stood beside Catherine in full support, but that loyalty may have come at a cost. Behind the palace doors, his relationship with King Charles is rumoured to be cooling, with meetings growing shorter, words more guarded, and silence hanging where warmth once lived. What began as a private shock, the Queen's inheritance favouring Catherine, soon escalated into a quiet but undeniable divide between father and son. Insiders say William didn't confront Charles in anger, but in resolve. He wanted answers, not about jewels, but about judgment. Why had Charles allowed Camilla to believe she was the intended recipient of Queen Elizabeth's treasures, only to stand by when Catherine became the unexpected heir? Charles, caught between duty to the crown and loyalty to his wife, reportedly offered no clarity. His defense of Camilla was swift, even sharp, but his acknowledgement of the Queen's final wishes was restrained, even reluctant. And in that space of unspoken truths, a rift began to form. Catherine, never one to involve herself in conflict, found herself drawn into the tension. Her name, her presence, her quiet rise, all of it became the unspoken source of unease between two generations of monarchy. During public appearances, the shift was subtle, but palpable. William and Charles no longer exchanged lingering glances or mirrored gestures. There were no shared smiles, no casual touches on the shoulder. It was as if diplomacy had replaced intimacy. A father and son now operating as sovereign and heir, but not as family. Palace sources whisper of awkward meetings where the room feels colder, where Charles speaks more to his staff than to his son, where Catherine's presence, once warmly welcomed, is now met with calculated politeness. And while no official comment has been made, there is growing concern behind the scenes that this emotional distance may soon find its way into public view. The year ahead looms with sensitive engagements and high-profile events, and aides fear that even a flicker of visible strain could shatter the image of unity the monarchy so desperately clings to. But perhaps the most telling signal lies not in the present, but in what's quietly being planned for the future. Discussions of succession priorities, once theoretical, are becoming active. Charles, reportedly aware of the growing sentiment surrounding Catherine, is said to be reconsidering certain ceremonial roles. Meanwhile, William, bolstered by public support and Catherine's soaring influence, is moving with increasing independence. What was once a seamless royal machine now feels like a chessboard, where every move carries consequences, and where one wrong gesture could shift the course of legacy itself. And now, all eyes turn toward what Catherine does next, because what she inherited wasn't just treasure, it was a mantle. In a family shaped by crowns, scandal, and survival, Catherine has emerged not just as a figure of poise, but of power. With Queen Elizabeth's silent blessing now etched in diamonds and emeralds, the path forward may not be dictated by blood, but by something far more powerful: earned grace. What began as a quiet inheritance has transformed into a national reckoning, with Catherine now seen by many not simply as the future queen, but as the rightful steward of the monarchy's heart. In the wake of emotional fallout, fractured loyalties, and whispered rivalries, it is Catherine, calm, composed, yet unmistakably present, who has become the symbol of continuity. Recent polls now show a striking shift. Public sentiment places her at the very top of royal favourability, even surpassing Prince William. The people aren't just watching her, they're rooting for her. Every step she takes, whether it's a solo engagement or a simple statement on children's mental health, reverberates like strategy. Analysts have noted that her schedule has subtly expanded, her speeches are growing more assertive, and her presence, once deliberately understated, is now being given centre stage. Insiders say King Charles has taken notice. Behind closed doors, ceremonial planning, once focused solely on William, is being re-evaluated to feature Catherine more prominently, not as an accessory, but as an anchor. Meanwhile, whispers around Camilla's team suggest a quiet withdrawal is already underway, her legacy roles potentially reassigned, her influence beginning to dim under the spotlight Catherine now effortlessly commands. This wasn't a power grab, it was a power reveal. For years, Catherine remained in the background, playing a long game rooted in patience and duty. And now, the result of that discipline is unfolding before the nation. Royal watchers speak of a Catherine era, a shift in energy that doesn't require a crown or coronation to be real. It's in the gestures, the honours, the symbolism, and, most of all, the trust she now carries. A trust that was once held by Queen Elizabeth herself. What happens next will not be written in law but in perception. And right now, perception has declared a verdict. Catherine is no longer preparing to lead, she already is. As the dust settles and the jewels shine anew, the world watches not what was taken but what was chosen. And Catherine, it seems, was chosen indeed. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.